She's in Australia right now promoting her latest book release, The Little Stranger. I'm talking to novelist Sarah Waters, and I'd like to welcome her to the Dykes on Mykes.
Thank you. Hi.
How are you going?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, very good.
I know you've been down in, is it Adelaide and Melbourne?
Yeah, I started in Sydney last week, although that's a bit of a blur, I have to say, because my jet lag was quite bad. But then I went on to Adelaide, and now I'm in Melbourne, and I'm feeling a lot more human, and it's really nice to be here. It's lovely.
Oh, fabulous. So I was preparing for this interview today, and I was reading a whole heap of press on the visit, and I've noticed like a huge similarity between all of the sort of press that comes out about you, and that's that every single one quotes your books as lesbo-Victorian romps. Now, I know it's just a few words, but after 5 novels, all of them quite different.
Yeah.
Does it ever get really frustrating to have years and years of work referred to again and again as lesbo-Victorian romps?
Yeah, it does a little bit, but you know, it was me who originated that phrase. So I've only got myself to blame, I suppose. I mean, you know, it was a good phrase for Tipping the Velvets, and it was a bit kind of true for Fingersmith as well. But no, not even Affinity. I mean, that was Victorian, but not even that one. You couldn't call that a romp. So it is a bit frustrating that gets trotted out.
I'm so, just sort of, it must be just so many years of writing just to get reduced down to 3 little words again and again. Look, our listeners are really familiar with your work. You know, things like, as we said, Tipping the Velvet, Fingersmith, Affinity, The Night Watch, and of course Little Stranger is your latest one. All of them have got, you know, really distinct characters and very vivid sort of storylines and structures. You know, where do they start? How do you develop these stories?
Well, you know, they've kind of very much grown, each has grown out of the previous one. So, I mean, Tipping the Velvet, you know, that was my first novel, and that in itself actually grew out of some academic work I'd been doing. I was interested in Victorian life, and I wanted to write a lesbian historical novel. I'd been reading a lot of them, and, you know, went to the 1890s, because I could see it had all this kind of lesbian potential to it. And then, you know, having written that, the next 2 Victorian novels sort of followed suit. And then I guess the biggest leap for me was to the 40s with The Night Watch. But again, it was, you know, I was interested in the period. I knew a bit about women's lives in the period. I knew that some women had really quite exciting wars, quite exciting wartime lives, and then, of course, they'd had to go back to something a bit more domestic after the war, and that was difficult for them. And, you know, so I guess it's partly what I take to a period and partly what I find in the period when I do my research that somehow produces a novel that I hope, you know, tells us something about the past, even while it's speaking to us, you know, in our present day as well. Yeah,
well, we had a listener actually who wrote in sort of because, you know, got online and, you know, put up there on Facebook, and her favourite character is Maud in Fingersmith. Oh yeah, and she was saying that, you know, Maud is such a complex character, and you've got such complex and full characters, and where do they come from? How do they emerge out of that research and out of those stories?
You know, I often asked about characterisation. I find it quite hard to talk about. It's funny. I think it's one of those things. It just sort of happens. You know, when I start thinking about my characters. I mean, your job as a novelist is to, you know, imagine yourself into somebody else's life, and I spend a lot of time thinking about, well, you know, what would it really be like to be this character, you know, living with these sorts of issues around them. And I think something happens for all writers around voice, and there's this marvellous point when you're writing a novel when your characters almost start talking to each other. Do you know what I mean? And they develop their own distinct voices. And for me, I think a dialogue is a great way of exploring and revealing character, because I think what we say, you know, our exchanges with people, even very small ones, often reveal a lot about our personalities and the way we interact with other people. So I think that's probably one of the ways I try and develop character. Yeah. So
none of them are from, you know, real people, ex-girlfriends, you know.
There's a little bit of that in The Night Watch. That's the only novel where I
had to ask.
Yeah. That's the only novel where I consciously drew on a bit more personal stuff. But even with that, you know, I mean, as soon as I start working on characters for a book, they develop personalities of their own. So even if my own stuff goes into the novels, it ends up morphing into something else, you know.
Each of these books that you've released has been either nominated or has won gajillion awards. I mean, I think that's a real feat for stories that have got very strong queer themes through them. What is it that makes your book so accessible to the mainstream public? What makes it digestible for them?
Well, it's certainly not something I ever set out to do. It wasn't like I had this crusade to introduce lesbian fiction to a mainstream audience.
It's a nice byproduct, though.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's been delightful. But I think I'm a relatively traditional writer. I write, as you say, I'm interested in characters and plots. I'm quite big on plots. I like sort of kind of an old-fashioned story, really. That's important to me. I like my books to be kind of emotionally feel quite true.
Mm-hmm.
I write quite visually, I think.
Very,
Yeah, so I think in some ways, I think, okay, the lesbian content might seem challenging to some straight people. I don't know, but there's nothing else about the books that's very challenging. I mean, they've got a bit bleak. They're a bit bleak at times, but apart from that, I think I don't know. I hope they sort of invite people in, by the strength of the storytelling.
Maybe the lesbianism really, or those sort of themes are really sort of incidental. The plot's actually the main.
Yes, that's true. That's also true. What it's like when you're a lesbian, when you're an out lesbian. Lesbianism is both completely important in your life, but it's also just incidental, as you say. You just kind of take it for granted, and I think that's what I definitely set out to do that with the novels. I'd read a lot of lesbian fiction. I was very confident that there were readers, for lesbian fiction, and it wasn't a big deal for me, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So it's not really a big deal for my characters, they might discover their sexuality, but that usually happens quite quickly, and then they get on with other things, sort of desire and loss, and which pretty universal things, really.
Absolutely. You're in the country promoting The Little Stranger at the moment, your latest book. What can readers expect with this one? I hear it's a ghost story.
Yeah, it's a kind of haunted house story. It's set just after the Second World War in Warwickshire in the UK, and it centres on a kind of crumbling country house called Hundreds Hall with a struggling gentry family living in it, and it's all narrated by a country doctor who gets to know them, and during the course of the novel, strange and increasingly frightening things start happening at the house. So it's kind of it's sort of a whodunit in a way, but it's kind of a ghost story too. But I have to say, before your readers get excited, there aren't any lesbians in it, which I've been apologising for to lesbian audiences, even from when I was writing it before it was published.
It's quite funny when you need to apologise for there not being enough gayness in a book.
I know. What a topsy-turvy world, eh?
It is.
Yeah.
Look, on that idea, because I'm a huge fan of queer literature. I've got bookshelves full of books at home, but my question is, what does the lesbian author read? What are your favourite books? What is it that you would want to sit down and read, in a cosy armchair by the fire?
Well, I read a lot for research, but that's always pleasant reading. So, I read a lot of 40s fiction when I was writing The Little Stranger and The Night Watch, and really got into some of those writers, so like writers like Elizabeth Bowen and Elizabeth Taylor, Graham Greene. I'm always happy to revisit them, or Daphne du Maurier. I'm a big Daphne du Maurier fan. Yeah. But otherwise, I'm really happy to read contemporary fiction. I know some writers don't read other authors while they're writing, but I don't feel like that at all. I'm always desperate to try and read good fiction, in the hope that it'll inspire my own. So, I've just read a great book by Jeff Dyer, Jeff in Venice, Death in Varanasi. That's cool. That was lots of fun, and I've just reread Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So, the
old classic,
exactly. A bit of everything, really.
So, well, what's next for you then? Where after The Little Stranger? What are you looking to do?
Well, I'm still historical, but I'm thinking of moving back slightly towards the 20s, which I'm reading about now and which I'm finding really fascinating. Lots similar issues to sort of post-Second World War life, women returning to domestic life, men returning from the services, but just different enough because it's that bit further back in time. So that's where I'm heading, and just to reassure lesbians who were disappointed that there aren't any lesbians in Little Stranger, I'm planning it to be a thoroughly lesbian story again.
The lesbians around Australia rejoice. No, that's great. This is something that it's interesting that talking about that, about having lesbian stories and stuff, because everyone that I've spoken to, that I've said, look, I'm going to have a chat to Sarah Waters, all of them have just gone, I love reading, Tipping the Velvet and Fingers. I came out start reading these books, and that was something that very much happened to me as well. You know, the first book that I ever read after, you know, Radcliffe Hall, The Well of Loneliness, was Tipping the Velvet.
It was a good antidote to Radcliffe Hall, I hope.
It was absolutely a fabulous antidote to Radcliffe Hall. I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah. I appreciate your time.